Across the ocean, the transport ship lurched through the dark Atlantic waters, its hull groaning against waves that seemed intent on swallowing it whole. Below deck, in a converted cargo hold, 73 German women huddled together, their faces pale in the dim light of swinging lanterns. They were prisoners of war, though few had ever held weapons. Most were nurses, radio operators, and clerks, women who had served the Wehrmacht in auxiliary roles and now found themselves on a journey to an unimaginable destination. Texas. Greta Hoffman sat with her back against the cold metal wall, her nurse's training keeping her alert to those around her who suffered from seasickness. At 32, she was among the oldest, and the younger women looked to her for reassurance she didn't feel. The war had taken everything. Her hospital in Berlin reduced to rubble, her fiancé killed at Stalingrad, her country in ruins. And now this. Exile to America, to a place she'd only read about in Karl May's westerns as a child. "Will they shoot us when we arrive?" whispered Liesel, a girl of barely 19 who had operated a radar station in France. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands trembling. Greta reached over and squeezed the girl's hand. "No, the Americans follow the Geneva Convention. We'll be treated fairly." She said this with more confidence than she felt. The propaganda had painted Americans as savages, though Greta had always suspected such claims were exaggerated. Still, uncertainty gnawed at her. The women had been captured at different times and places, some when their field hospitals were overrun, others when their units surrendered in the final chaotic days of the war in Europe. They'd been processed through camps in England, stripped of their uniforms and possessions, given rough cotton dresses that hung shapeless on their bodies. Then came the ship, this floating prison that carried them away from everything they'd known. As night deepened, the women tried to sleep, their bodies swaying with the ship's movement. Greta closed her eyes and thought of her mother's kitchen in Munich, the smell of fresh bread and coffee. She wondered if the house still stood, if her mother had survived the bombing raids. Communications had been cut for months. She knew nothing of her family's fate. The journey took 12 days. 12 days of monotony broken only by meager meals of thin soup and hard bread. 12 days of women weeping in the darkness, of prayers whispered in desperate voices, of fear that grew with each passing hour. Some women withdrew into themselves, staring at nothing. Others talked incessantly, clinging to conversation as a lifeline against the terror of the unknown. When they finally reached New York Harbor, Greta was surprised by the city's towering skyline, untouched by war. The buildings gleamed in the sunlight, so different from the ruins they'd left behind. American soldiers, young men with easy smiles, watched them disembark. The women flinched at their approach, but there was no violence, no cruelty, just efficiency and a strange, casual kindness that seemed incomprehensible. They were loaded onto trains, and thus began another journey across a country so vast it defied imagination. Greta watched America pass by the windows. Endless forests, great rivers, cities that sprawled across the landscape. And then the land changed, becoming flatter, more sparse. The green gave way to brown earth and endless sky. "Texas," someone said, and the word rippled through their car like a prayer or a curse. None of them knew which. The camp at Crystal City. Crystal City Internment Camp emerged from the Texas landscape like a mirage. Rows of whitewashed barracks surrounded by chain-link fence and guard towers. But as their bus passed through the gates, Greta noticed something unexpected. Families. Japanese-American families walked along the camp streets. Children played in a dusty yard. Women hung laundry on lines strung between buildings. This was not the harsh prison camp they'd imagined. The German women were processed quickly. A stern-faced but not unkind American officer, Captain Morrison, explained through an interpreter that they would be housed separately from the other internees. They would work in the camp, cleaning, cooking, helping in the infirmary. They would be paid a small wage. They would be treated, he emphasized, according to the Geneva Convention. "You are prisoners, but you are also under our protection," he said, his eyes sweeping over the exhausted women. "Follow the rules, and you'll be treated fairly." Their barracks was long and narrow, lined with iron beds. Each woman received a thin mattress, 2 blankets, a pillow, and a small locker. It was sparse, but it was clean. After the ship and the uncertainty, it felt almost luxurious. Greta claimed a bed near the window and sat down heavily, feeling the weight of the journey settle into her bones. The first days were disorienting. The Texas heat was oppressive, unlike anything they'd experienced in Germany. The sun seemed to press down on them with physical weight, and the air was thick and still. The women moved slowly through their assigned tasks, struggling to adjust to the climate and the routine. Greta was assigned to work in the camp infirmary alongside Dr. Sarah Chun, a Japanese-American physician who treated both internees and POWs. Dr. Chun was quiet and efficient, her English accented but clear. She showed Greta where supplies were kept, how the clinic operated, and treated her not as an enemy, but as a fellow medical professional. "I was born in California," Dr. Chun told her one afternoon as they sorted bandages. "My family had a farm. Then came Pearl Harbor, and suddenly we were the enemy. They took everything, our land, our home, our dignity. Brought us here." She paused, her hands stilling. War makes enemies of everyone. Greta found herself confiding in the doctor about her own losses. They worked side by side, two women from opposite sides of the world, finding common ground in healing and shared exile. The camp had an odd rhythm. There were rules and regulations, roll calls and curfews, but there was also a strange domesticity. Women created routines, found small ways to maintain dignity. Some taught languages to each other. Others organized a choir. The Japanese families shared their traditions during festivals, and gradually, barriers began to dissolve. But beneath the surface, homesickness ran deep. Letters from home were rare and heavily censored. News of the war came in fragments. Germany's surrender had already happened, but the details were unclear. Many women worried about families they couldn't reach. Cities they'd heard were destroyed. Liesel, the young radar operator, struggled most visibly. She was haunted by nightmares, crying out in her sleep. Greta would sit with her in the dark hours, holding her hand, reminding her that they had survived, that survival itself was a form of victory. As weeks turned into months, the women began to understand their situation more fully. They were in limbo. The war was over, but they couldn't go home. Germany was occupied, divided, chaotic. There was no infrastructure to return them, no guarantee of safety. So they waited in Texas, in this strange camp where former enemies lived side by side, where the desert heat baked everything to its essence. The guard named Ruth. Ruth Henderson had never expected to be guarding German prisoners of war in her hometown. At 24, she joined the Women's Army Corps' seeking adventure, expecting to be sent overseas. Instead, she found herself assigned to Crystal City, just a few miles from the farm where she'd grown up. Her mother brought her fresh eggs every Sunday, and her father shook his head at the irony of his daughter guarding enemies on Texas soil. Ruth was assigned to supervise the German women's work details and conduct random inspections of their barracks. The assignment made her uncomfortable at first. She'd been raised on newsreels showing Nazi atrocities, had lost a cousin at Normandy. These women represented an enemy that had brought such suffering to the world. But as she watched them work, she found her certainty wavering. They didn't look like monsters. They looked tired, sad, displaced. Many were younger than her. Some were older, with worry lines etched deep in their faces. They followed orders quietly, worked diligently, and in their off hours, sang sad songs in German that made Ruth's throat tighten even though she didn't understand the words. Greta Hoffmann caught her attention first. The older German woman carried herself with a quiet dignity, even in her shapeless prison dress. She worked in the infirmary with Dr. Chun, and Ruth would sometimes see them through the window, heads bent together over a patient, their movements synchronized with professional efficiency. One day, Ruth was assigned to escort Greta to the camp commander's office. There had been a request for her medical expertise in treating a difficult case. As they walked across the compound, Ruth found herself speaking. "You were a nurse in Germany?" Greta looked at her with surprise, then nodded. "Yes, in Berlin. A surgical ward. Must have been hard." The bombing, I mean. Greta's face tightened. Yes, very hard. We would operate during raids, the building shaking, lights flickering. Sometimes we lost patients not to their wounds, but to bombs that fell while they lay on our tables. She paused. War is cruel to everyone, especially those who try to heal. Ruth felt something shift in her chest. She'd thought of the enemy in abstract terms: armies, ideologies, nations. But here was a woman who had tried to save lives, who had worked under unimaginable conditions to heal the wounded. The lines suddenly seemed less clear. After that, Ruth found herself seeking opportunities to interact with the German women. She learned their names, their stories. There was Margaret, who'd been a teacher before the war and now gave secret lessons to the younger women. There was Anna, who'd lost her entire family in the bombing of Dresden. There was Frida, who'd been engaged to a soldier who never came home from the Eastern Front. Their stories began to weigh on Ruth. These women had suffered losses as profound as any American family. They grieved for destroyed homes, missing loved ones, a country that no longer existed in any recognizable form. They were trapped in a strange land, unable to go home, uncertain of what home even meant anymore. Ruth's colleagues noticed her softening attitude. Some approved, believing in treating prisoners humanely. Others were skeptical, warning her not to be fooled by enemy sympathies. But Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening, that these small human connections across the barrier of war mattered in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She began bringing small gifts, magazines that she'd finished reading, bars of soap, a deck of cards. Nothing that violated regulations, but small gestures of recognition that the German women were human beings, not just prisoners. Greta always accepted these gifts with careful dignity, distributing them among the women who needed them most. One evening, Ruth found Liesel sitting alone behind the barracks, sobbing. The girl was homesick, desperate for news of her family in Cologne. Ruth sat down beside her, not touching but present. She didn't speak German, and Liesel's English was limited, but somehow the silence communicated what words couldn't. That suffering was universal, that compassion didn't require a common language. When Liesel finally calmed, she looked at Ruth with red-rimmed eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Ruth nodded, feeling tears in her own eyes. "You're welcome." Letters from a broken land. The mail came on Tuesdays, brought by truck from the main post office in San Antonio. For the German women, mail call was both anticipated and dreaded. Letters from home were rare, subject to strict censorship, and often brought news of losses rather than reassurance. Greta had been in Crystal City for 4 months before she received her first letter. Her hands trembled as she opened the thin envelope, noting how it had been opened and resealed by military censors. The letter was from her younger sister, Clara, and it was brief, only 1 page, many sentences blacked out by the censor's pen. What remained was devastating. Their mother had died during a bombing raid in March. The house was gone. Clara was living in a displaced persons camp outside Munich, surviving on rations that were barely adequate. She didn't ask when Greta might come home. Perhaps she knew that question would be censored, or perhaps she simply had no hope of reunion. Berlin is unrecognizable, Clara had written in the one in censored paragraph. The streets are rivers of rubble. People dig for food in the ruins. Sometimes I think the living envy the dead. But we survive. That is what we do. We survive. Greta read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in her locker. She didn't cry. She cried so much already that she felt hollowed out, empty of tears. Instead, she felt a profound numbness settle over her, a sense that the distance between Texas and Germany was more than geographical. It was existential. The world she'd known was gone. Other women had similar experiences. Anna received news that her parents and 2 brothers had all perished in Dresden. Frida learned that her fiancé was in a Soviet POW camp, his fate uncertain. Margaret discovered that her school had been commandeered by occupying forces, her books burned, her life's work erased. The letters painted a picture of a Germany destroyed, not just physically, but spiritually. Cities were rubble. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. The occupying powers had divided the country into zones, and families found themselves separated by new borders that might as well have been oceans. And hanging over everything was the revelation of the camps. The concentration camps, the death camps, the systematic murder of millions. The women in Crystal City heard whispers of it, saw photographs that made their stomachs turn, struggled to reconcile what they believed with what had been done in their country's name. How could we not have known? Liesel asked one night as the women gathered in their barracks. How could it have happened without us knowing? Some knew, Greta said quietly, and some of us didn't want to know. We were frightened, and fear makes people blind. She looked around at the faces watching her. We will carry this shame forever, but we must also carry the responsibility to ensure it never happens again. The conversation continued late into the night, women grappling with guilt, with complicity, with the horror of what had been done in their name. Some defended themselves, insisting they'd only followed orders, only tried to survive. Others wept with shame and rage. There were no easy answers, no absolution. Ruth, making her evening rounds, heard the voices from the barracks and paused outside. She couldn't understand the German, but she understood the tone: anguish, confusion, grief. She thought about her cousin who died at Normandy, about all the suffering the war had caused. But she also thought about these women, trying to make sense of their role in a catastrophe they hadn't fully understood until it was too late. The complexity of it all exhausted her. Or it seemed so clear when she joined up. Good versus evil, America versus tyranny. But here in Crystal City, face to face with the supposed enemy, everything was muddied. These women had suffered. They'd been complicit, perhaps, or willfully blind, but they'd also been victims of a regime that had consumed its own people. Ruth didn't have answers either, but she was beginning to understand that asking the questions mattered, that wrestling with the complexity was itself a form of honoring the truth. When the lights went out in the barracks, Greta lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought of her mother, buried in rubble somewhere in Munich. She thought of her fiancé, frozen in the Russian snow. She thought of all the dead, the millions upon millions of dead, and wondered if humanity would ever find its way back from such darkness. Small kindnesses. As summer deepened into fall, life at Crystal City took on a peculiar normalcy. The German women had been there for 6 months, and routines had solidified into daily rhythms. Work assignments, meal times, evening recreation. The days flowed one into another with a sameness that was both comforting and suffocating. Ruth had been promoted to sergeant and now had more authority over the German women's section of the camp. She used this authority gently, trying to ease the monotony of camp life where she could. When Margaret asked for books, Ruth arranged for a small lending library. When several women wanted to plant a garden, Ruth convinced the camp commander to allow a small plot behind their barracks. The garden became a lifeline. The women worked the Texas soil with surprising enthusiasm, planting vegetables and flowers brought from the camp's main supply. Greta found herself on her knees in the dirt, her hands working the earth, and felt something loosen in her chest. There was life here, growth, the possibility of something beautiful emerging from barren ground. Dr. Chan would sometimes visit the garden, admiring the neat rows and offering advice on plants that thrived in the Texas heat. My family had a farm in California, she told Greta one afternoon. I miss working the land. There's honesty in it. You plant, you tend, you harvest. War has no such clarity. The two women worked side by side, pulling weeds, and Greta felt a kinship that transcended nationality. They were both exiles, both women trying to maintain dignity in circumstances beyond their control, both healers in a world that seemed bent on destruction. Ruth began bringing small treats when she could, a few extra oranges from her family's trees, occasionally a newspaper so the women could practice their English. Once a harmless romance novel that was passed around the barracks until its pages were worn soft. These gestures violated no regulations, but represented a recognition of the women's humanity that touched them deeply. One evening, Ruth arrived with her guitar. She'd been working up the courage for weeks, uncertain how the gesture would be received. She sat on the steps of the barracks and began to play, First some American folk songs, then, haltingly, a German melody her grandmother had taught her years ago. The women emerged from the barracks, drawn by the music. They stood in a semicircle, listening. When Ruth fumbled the German song, Greta stepped forward and began to sing, her voice clear and strong. Other women joined in, their voices blending in harmony that was achingly beautiful. Ruth played, and the women sang, and for a brief moment, the war and the camp and the separation of nations all fell away. There was only music, only human voices raised together in something that felt like prayer. When the song ended, there was silence. Then Liesel began to cry, not the desperate sobbing of her nightmares, but quiet tears of release. Others cried too, and Ruth found her own eyes wet. She didn't fully understand what had shifted, but she knew something important had happened. "Thank you," Greta said to Ruth in careful English. "You give us." She searched for the word. "You give us hope." Ruth nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The music became a weekly ritual. Ruth would bring her guitar, and the women would sing. German songs, American songs, sometimes songs in languages none of them fully understood, but all could feel. The Japanese-American families heard the music and began to gather nearby. Soon, the weekly concerts included multiple languages, multiple traditions, a strange harmony emerging from the camp's diversity. The camp commander, Colonel Patterson, observed these gatherings with mixed feelings. He was a by-the-book officer who believed in regulations and clear hierarchies. But he was also a decent man who understood that maintaining morale among prisoners was essential to maintaining order. As long as rules weren't broken, he allowed the music to continue. The day everything changed, November arrived with cooler temperatures and a shift in the camp's atmosphere. News from Germany was consistently grim. The Nuremberg trials were underway, and the full scope of Nazi atrocities was being documented for the world. The German women in Crystal City struggled with this information, torn between denial and devastating recognition. "My brother was in the SS," Anna confessed to Greta one night. "I didn't know what he did. He never spoke of it. But now I wonder, what if he was one of them? What if he participated in?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Greta had no comforting words. How could anyone comfort such knowledge? Instead, she simply held Anna as she wept, offering the only thing she could, presence in the face of unbearable truth. The camp's routine continued, but shadows had deepened. The women moved through their days carrying a weight that pressed on their shoulders, a shame that couldn't be articulated or absolved. They were Germans, and Germany had committed unspeakable crimes. That association, that identity, felt like a mark they could never erase. Ruth noticed the change. The women were quieter, more withdrawn. The weekly music sessions continued, but the joy had leached out of them. Even the garden, entering its winter dormancy, seemed to reflect the camp's mood, brown and dry, waiting for spring that might never come. Then, on November 15th, something unexpected happened. Colonel Patterson received a telegram from the International Red Cross. German civilians were starving. The occupation zones were struggling to provide adequate food supplies. Millions were at risk of malnutrition, particularly children and the elderly. The telegram requested that POW camps consider care packages, not elaborate, just basic necessities that might ease the crisis. Patterson called a meeting with his staff. "The war's over," he said. "These people are no longer our active enemies. If we can help, shouldn't we?" There was debate. Some officers argued that Germans had brought their fate upon themselves, that American resources shouldn't be wasted on former enemies when Americans had their own needs. Others, including Ruth, argued for compassion. "We won the war," Ruth said quietly. "Now we have a chance to win the peace. How we treat defeated enemies will determine what kind of country we are." Patterson decided to allow a pilot program. Working with local churches and the Red Cross, the camp would facilitate care packages to Germany. Any internees or POWs who wanted to participate could contribute to packages, and American families would be invited to contribute as well. When Greta heard the news, she couldn't quite believe it. They would do this? Americans would send food to Germany. Ruth nodded. "Some will. Not everyone. There's still a lot of anger. But some people believe in mercy, even for enemies. The program began modestly. A table was set up in the camp's community center where people could drop off contributions. The response was slow at first. A few cans of soup, some packages of dried beans. But then something remarkable happened. Ruth's mother arrived with boxes from her church. "We took a collection," she explained to Ruth. Half the congregation contributed. They remembered how German Americans in our community were treated during the last war, how fear made us cruel. They don't want to repeat those mistakes. Japanese American families contributed despite their own hardships. "We know what it's like to be seen as enemies because of where we were born," Dr. Chen told Greta. "We choose to be better than those who judged us." The packages grew. Canned goods, dried milk, flour, sugar, coffee. Simple things, but luxuries in a Germany still reeling from total defeat. The German women in the camp began to help sort and pack the goods, their hands moving with purpose, tears streaming down their faces as they thought of their families, their country, the millions suffering. "Why?" Liesel asked Ruth one day as they packed boxes together. "Why would you help us?" After everything, Ruth paused, considering her answer carefully. "Because you're human beings. Because your children didn't start this war. Because mercy is always a choice, and I choose mercy." It was the first time in months that Greta felt something like hope. Peanut butter. December came, and with it, Christmas preparations. The camp had always made some effort to acknowledge holidays. It was part of maintaining morale and order. But this year, Colonel Patterson decided to do something special. With the Care Package program showing success, he wanted to demonstrate American generosity more directly. "We'll host a Christmas dinner for all internees and POWs," he announced to his staff. "A real feast, as much as supplies allow. Turkey, ham, all the trimmings. And we'll invite local families to help serve and celebrate with us." Ruth was assigned to coordinate the German women's participation. She found Greta in the infirmary and explained the plan. Greta looked skeptical. "A feast? For prisoners. You're not prisoners anymore." "Not really. The war's over. You're just waiting to go home." Ruth paused. "Besides, it's Christmas. Seems like the right thing to do." The preparations became a camp-wide effort. Japanese American women shared traditional recipes that could be adapted to available ingredients. German women taught American volunteers how to make stollen and Lebkuchen, improvising with what they had. Children made decorations from scraps of paper and cloth. The kitchen staff worked around the clock. The camp's cooks, supplemented by volunteers, prepared dishes for hundreds of people. But there was a problem: bread. They needed enormous quantities of bread, and the camp's bakery couldn't keep up. Ruth's mother had a solution. "The ladies' auxiliary has been making sandwiches for soldiers being shipped overseas. We can make sandwiches for the camp dinner instead. Quick to prepare, easy to serve, filling." "What kind of sandwiches?" Ruth asked. "Peanut butter. We've got cases of it. The Army surplus store donated them. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches." Ruth hesitated. Peanut butter was quintessentially American, something few of the German women had likely ever tasted. But time was short, and they needed to feed hundreds. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." On Christmas Eve, as the sun set over the Texas desert, tables were set up in the camp's main yard. Strings of electric lights had been hung, creating a festive atmosphere. Families arrived, American volunteers, camp staff, local community members who'd heard about the dinner and wanted to participate. The German women emerged from their barracks wearing the best clothes they had, still simple, still worn, but cleaned and pressed with care. Greta had braided her hair in a crown, the way she'd worn it before the war. Liesel had fashioned a necklace from string and small stones. They were trying, despite everything, to reclaim some sense of dignity and normalcy. The food was laid out buffet style. Turkey and ham, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, cranberry sauce, a feast beyond anything the women had seen in years. They moved through the line slowly, overcome by the abundance, the generosity, the simple fact that someone had cared enough to prepare this meal for them. When they reached the end of the buffet line, Ruth's mother was there with baskets of sandwiches. "Peanut butter and jelly," she announced cheerfully, handing them out. "A little taste of America." Greta took her sandwich with thanks, and sat down at one of the long tables. Around her, other German women were doing the same, examining the sandwiches with curiosity. Most had never seen peanut butter before, had no idea what to expect. Greta took a bite. The taste was unlike anything she'd experienced, sweet and salty and rich, creamy and substantial. It was filling in a way the thin soups and hard bread of the past years had never been. But more than the taste, it was what the sandwich represented. Abundance, generosity, the simple fact that someone had made this food and given it freely, asking nothing in return. Something broke open inside her. The grief she'd been holding back, the loss and fear and exhaustion. It all came flooding out. Tears streamed down her face as she held the sandwich, unable to continue eating, unable to stop crying. Tears of humanity. Around Greta, the same scene was unfolding. Women were crying, not quietly, but with deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere primal and broken. Liesel dropped her sandwich and covered her face with her hands, her whole body trembling. Anna wept in her napkin, unable to catch her breath. Margaret sat frozen, tears streaming silently down her weathered cheeks. The American families watched in confusion, uncertain what they'd done wrong. Ruth's mother approached Greta, concern etched on her face. "Honey, what is it? Is something wrong with the food?" Greta looked up at her, unable to speak through her tears. She shook her head frantically. No, nothing was wrong. Everything was wrong, but nothing about this sandwich, this gesture, this moment of inexplicable kindness. Ruth hurried over, kneeling beside Greta's chair. "What happened? What's wrong?" Greta managed to find words, her English broken by emotion. Is good. The food is good. She struggled, searching for the right words to explain something she barely understood herself. "Is too much kind. We are enemy. We bring death. Our country, so much evil. And you give us food. Good food. You give us." She gestured helplessly at the feast, at the lights, at the American families who had come to serve them. Understanding dawned in Ruth's eyes. This wasn't about the sandwich. It was about everything the sandwich represented. Mercy for the undeserving, generosity for enemies, recognition of humanity when it would have been easier to simply see monsters. "You're not our enemies anymore," Ruth said gently. "The war is over. You're just people far from home, and it's Christmas." But Greta shook her head. "No, you don't understand. In Germany, we have nothing. My sister writes, people starve. Children eat from garbage. We destroyed everything, and now we suffer. Is justice, maybe, but you give us peanut butter sandwich." She laughed through her tears at the absurdity of it. Peanut butter sandwich. Something so simple, so American. And it break my heart because I don't deserve this kindness. We don't deserve. Other women were having similar conversations with American volunteers. Frida tried to explain to a bewildered pastor why the turkey made her weep. Anna clutched the hand of a farmer's wife and sobbed out her gratitude in broken English mixed with German. Dr. Chin watched from a distance, her own eyes wet. She understood in a way the American volunteers couldn't. She understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy, to be stripped of everything, to live with shame and loss. And she understood what it meant when someone looked past that designation and saw simply a human being worthy of dignity. Colonel Patterson stood with his staff, watching the scene unfold. Some officers looked uncomfortable, uncertain how to process this raw display of emotion. But Patterson's face was thoughtful. "Sergeant Henderson," he called Ruth over. "What's happening here?" Ruth tried to explain. The weight these women carried, the losses they'd endured, the shame of their country's crimes, the shock of being treated with kindness despite everything. "I think," she said slowly, "they've been braced for punishment. They expected cruelty, or at best indifference. A peanut butter sandwich shouldn't be remarkable, but given everything, it's overwhelming." Patterson nodded slowly. "War makes monsters of us all, in different ways. Maybe peace is about remembering how to be human again." He paused. "Make sure they know they're welcome here. Not as prisoners, but as people." As the evening wore on, the tears gradually subsided. The women ate their feast, still overwhelmed but beginning to accept this strange gift. The camp's children, both American and Japanese American, played together in the yard, their laughter cutting through the emotional weight. Music started, Ruth's guitar, someone's harmonica, voices raised in carols in multiple languages. Greta sat with her half-eaten peanut butter sandwich, feeling wrung out but somehow lighter. Liesel sat beside her, hiccuping from crying but managing a tremulous smile. "I will remember this always," Liesel said quietly. "This Christmas in Texas, when Americans gave us peanut butter sandwiches and showed us that maybe we could be forgiven. Not for what our country did. We can never be forgiven for that. But for being human, for suffering, for trying to survive. Maybe that can be forgiven." Greta squeezed her hand. "Yes, maybe that is the beginning." As midnight approached and the camp quieted, the women returned to their barracks. They would sleep that night full, warm, and carrying something they hadn't had in years, hope. Not hope that the past could be changed or erased, but hope that the future might hold space for redemption, for healing, for the slow and painful work of becoming human again. The peanut butter sandwiches became legend among the German women at Crystal City. Years later, when they'd finally returned to Germany and were rebuilding their lives, they would tell their children and grandchildren about that Christmas in Texas, about Americans who could have been cruel but chose kindness, about how a simple sandwich became a symbol of mercy. And they would say, their eyes distant with memory, "That was when we learned that humanity could survive even the worst we'd done to it. That was when we began to believe in grace."